Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. You're listening to 99.1 WQRT, and I have the honor of having Leanne Betasamosake on with us today. She's a Anishinaabe writer, scholar, and musician, a member of the Alderville First Nation in Ontario. She's the author of several books, including As We Have Always Done, published by University of Minnesota Press, and This Accident of Being Lost. Her latest album, The Theory of Ice, has just been released, and it is streaming on all platforms. So you can look for it there. And I think I'm gonna hand it over to Leanne now. Thank you so much. Oh, and my name is Shate Marsh. I'm co-founder of Picard Collaborative, Director of Programming Exhibitions. Now handing it back over to Leanne. Thank you.
Thank you. Ani kinawaya gitagabajina denawema kinagachi Anishinaabe Ogaming Nadonjaba Betasamosake Nadishnakas Chimigwech to Shate Marsh and the Big Car Collaborative for inviting me to spend time with you today, and thanks for everyone who was able to zoom in. I'm sad that we're not together in person, but I'm happy that we're able to come together in this way. I'm going to be talking about my project Noopiming today, and you'll see on your screen is a cover of the book Noopiming that was published by the House of Anansi Press in Canada and by the University of Minnesota Press in the US. I'm from the Michi-Sagik Anishinaabe or Ojibwe Nation, and our territory, the Mississauga part of that territory, is on the north shore of Lake Ontario, between roughly the cities of Toronto and Ottawa in Ontario, Canada. My particular understanding of life comes from this part of the world. It comes from this Michi-Sagik Anishinaabe practice of life, living in deep relationality to the land, the water, the plants, the animals, and all of the peoples of Kinagachi Anishinaabe Ogaming, the place where we all live and work together. It comes from Neyano Nibimong Gichigaming, or the Great Lakes. It comes from the maple sugar bushes carrying and filtering water from the soil, combining it with light, and then converting it to sweet sugar. It comes from the lakeshore's bowl of minomen or wild rice, gathering strength in mid-July and moving from floating form to standing upright. It comes from the black bears that wake up in Makwagisis or February, turn in their dens on beds of blueberry branches, and then settle back into fasting and dreaming for a few more weeks. This land has taught me that Anishinaabe life is continual, reciprocal, and reflective. It is a sometimes critical engagement with my ancestors, those yet to be born, and the nations of being with whom I share time and space. I think of it as a living constellation of co-resistance with all of the anti-colonial peoples of the world and the worlds they build. This land has taught me that Anishinaabe life is a persistent world-building process, despite of and in spite of the imposition of the colonial machinery of elimination. This procedure for Indigenous life and Indigenous living is one that Indigenous people used long before our existence ever depended upon our ability to resist and survive the violence of capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and expansive and recursive dispossession. My ancestors woke up each morning and created an Anishinaabe world. They animated and built their political systems of governance and diplomacy. They built their collective philosophical and ethical understandings. They made processes for solving conflict and establishing balance, and they built their economy with the consent of the plant and animal nations. They built, maintained, and nurtured systems for sharing knowledge and taking care of each other. They worked collectively to produce, reproduce, replicate, amplify, and share Anishinaabe life, because if they did not, Anishinaabe worlds would not exist. They were makers. They got up each morning and they worked hard, not the white man wage labor, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 kind of work, not the kind of work where you outsource the labor of living so you can do something more important, but the kind of work that values above all else the way one lives. They got up, worked hard all day long in a way that brought forth more life. This algorithm of living, theory and praxis, seemingly intertwined and relationally responsive to one another, is generated through intimate relations with Michi-Sagi Anishinaabe land that is constructed and defined by our intellectual, spiritual, emotional, artistic, and physical relationship with it. Living as a creative act, self-determination, consent, kindness, and freedom practiced daily in all our relations. Practices replicated over and over. The practice of making as a material basis for experiencing and influencing the world. Living with the purpose of generating more life. Our infrastructure for life was relationships, not institutions. Our orientation for life was internationalist. We shared space and time with plant and animal nations and different indigenous nations, mostly without the use of enclosures and violence. We did not bank capital to protect us in hard times. We had interdependent relationships with other animal and plant nations and other human families and neighboring indigenous nations. And in times of difficulty, we relied upon this practice of relational diplomacy in the worlds it creates to survive, with the understanding that in return, we would also take care of their worlds. We have always been an intellectual and an artistic people. We have always had theory, meaning, philosophy, and aesthetic principles. These were not individual pursuits. They were communal making practices. Everybody had their own stories and their own songs and their own voice, and those things were considered and celebrated and woven together into layered collective understandings. My people are constant storytellers throughout the day and throughout the seasons. Stories are the fabric of daily life. They are the sonics that pulls one into space where worlds are fully embodied experiences. Sound is the connector to emotions and intellect belong beyond one's own body. It is the connector to all of the relations that make up the land. The land holds story. From this is the place where you two were little and got stung by a bee and fell into the beaver pond, to before that monster cottage was built, your great-grandparents always camped there, to this is the place where you first tasted smart berries, and look, there are geese flying overhead in a V. Stories not only fill our worlds, they make our worlds, but only if you have the skills to find meaning in oral literature, but only if the story lives and breathes inside of you. But only if you wrap stories around you like a blanket and take them out to consider from time to time. Telling stories is a foundational practice of Indigenous peoples. This practice of telling stories fills the interstitial spaces of worlds with recognition and affirmations, with all of its generative and degenerative energies. It's a practice of listening with one's open heart to the sound of Anishinaabe across time and space in all of our manifestations. This practice of telling stories is the practice of generating a diversity of meanings. It is a practice of deep relationality, not a looking at, but a looking with, or looking through, or a thinking through together. The practice of telling stories is a practice of scaling and releasing sound across scales, articulating our individual experiences, relating them to collective experiences, and generating systemic critique. More important than the telling is the culture of listening. The practice of telling stories is the practice of constantly building Anishinaabe worlds while simultaneously living in them. We are bodies made of stories and connections. hubs in the network of Indigenous living, and our practice of telling stories is one of the reasons that I'm here today, in spite of centuries of colonial violence. This is the context within which I live and work and think and create. And this is the context that created the novel Noopiming, The Cure for White Ladies that I'm going to be talking about today. I intended Noopiming to be a site of Anishinaabe living. I intended Noopiming to be a gathering piece with several iterations across media. I intended Noopiming to remove power from the colonial and immerse it once again in the biosphere of Anishinaabe caring. I intended Noopiming to be an immersive experience, a communal engagement in meaning making, where together we're continually remaking ourselves and asking, what does it mean to be immersed in Anishinaabe living? I wanted the book to be a continuous engagement with Anishinaabe present and presence, and with the Anishinaabe study of life. I was influenced by the way Fred Moten uses the word study in the undercomments. Quote, "We are committed to the idea that study is what you do with other people. It's talking and walking around with other people, working, dancing, suffering, some irreducible convergence of all three, held under the name of speculative practice. The notion of a rehearsal, being in a kind of workshop, playing in a band, in a jam session, or old men sitting on a porch, or people working together in a factory, these are various modes of activity. The point of calling it study is to mark the incessant and irreversible intellectuality of these activities is already present." So Noopiming is a refusal, and in Noopiming's practice of refusal, it's intended to be generative. Noopiming asks something different of the reader. It is meant to both disrupt and expand. I want to start with the cover image. You might recognize this as an image from Anishinaabe artist Rebecca Belmore called Fringe. Fringe was originally displayed as a billboard in Montreal's Mois de la Photo 2007 event, and it's a photograph mounted in a light box. And this is where I first encountered the image. If we could have the next slide, please. This quote, Rebecca is explaining the image in conversation with Kathleen Ritter at the Vancouver Art Gallery. "As an Indigenous woman, my female body speaks for itself. Some people interpret the image of this reclining figure as a cadaver. However, to me, it is a wound that is on the mend. It wasn't self-inflicted, but nonetheless, it is bearable. She can sustain it. So it's a very simple scenario. She will get up and go on, but she will carry that mark with her. She will turn her back on the aristocracies afflicted upon her body and find resilience in the future. The Indigenous female body is the politicized body, the historical body. It's the body that doesn't disappear." I was in Montreal in 2007. My partner was on day 3 of a difficult install in a gallery there, and I was taking our kids to the planetarium on a Saturday morning. And I looked up walking along with these 2 toddlers, and I see this billboard, which made me so happy, actually. I was sort of a stay-at-home mom in jogging pants, dragging interested toddlers to an educational experience. And I saw this image. And it was like Belmore had kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said, "I see you." I think that, to me, the image is genderless. The trauma is acknowledged, but we don't stay in it. It doesn't define the image. And in some ways, it's even refused or repulsed, or it starts to be kind of changed within the body. It had a coded and layered meaning for me. So it affirmed me as an Indigenous woman, but it also, I think, for a non-Indigenous audience is confrontational in that it's putting the violence of colonialism at the center as something that needs to be reckoned with. The image also really reminds me of a stage in the hide tanning process where you stitch up the holes. And I thought that was a really strong metaphor for me. It also gestures towards Audra Simpson's work in a paper that she published in Theory and Event called The State as a Man. And she talks about Teresa Spence and Loretta Saunders and the gender of settler sovereignty, and about how the female body or queer bodies for Indigenous cultures are a political order, an embodied political economy, an embodied ethic, and therefore a threat to settler sovereignty and something that needs to be eliminated. There are two other works of Belmore's that influence this novel. Can we have the next slide, please? This is called Tower, and it's from the exhibition Facing the Monumental in 2018 at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto. And this work stems from when Belmore was living in the downtown east side of Vancouver, where she witnessed the impact of urban dispossession in the form of gentrification with rapid condo development and homelessness. And she, in talking about this piece, she says, I understand the severity of land as real estate, everything owned, everything for sale, and how in our so-called great cities, the reality of owning anything is out of reach for most of us with no solution in sight. So as she was staring into the construction site of yet another condominium, all she could think about was landlessness and those who are without a home. She also told me that in her witnessing the sound of the wheels of shopping carts going up and down her street, pushed by people who had precarious housing, figured into her Anishinaabe living. So Tower then is a 15-foot installation of shopping carts, the makeshift homes for so many. And she has made them into a shiny metal condominium. The carts are filled with a locally sourced clay from below the city, grounding the tower to land. Tower was installed beside the next image. So if we can have the next slide, which is called Tarpaulin. This is another sort of image that enters into the storytelling of Noopiming, is the tarp. Anishinaabe life is one of kinetics and creation, and our people make homes and ceremonial spaces and teaching lads out of the materials that are available to us. But this monument, I think, is also not just about us, but it's about all different people who have been displaced and dispossessed, the making of migrant people who are forced to make homes out of tents or tarps and encampments or whatever materials are available. Tent cities are made out of crisis and protests, and home is made sometimes out of one's own body. So this kind of leads into a discussion of tarps, which have shown up in both Rebecca and my work because of their utility, because of their inexpensive nature, their versatility, and their aesthetic and material presence in our communities. Belmore explains that one of her new sculptures is this one that we're looking at, a blanket-sized tarpaulin made out of ceramic clay sourced from beneath the city of Winnipeg. And from afar, when you first enter the gallery, it looks like there's a figure resting under the tarp, but as you approach, the tarp is empty. All right, next slide. So the title of the book, Noopiming means in the bush. And I'm riffing off of a book that was written in 1852 by Susanna Moodie, who was born in England and who was a settler in my territory on the north side of Lake Ontario. And she is a celebrated canonical figure in Canadian literature because she was one of the first women to write a book in what would become Canada. And her book was called Roughing It in the Bush. And it was a guidebook for settlers who were coming into my territory and colonizing it and settling it. And Susanna Moodie didn't like the bush, and she didn't like cutting down the forest and farming, because it was a hard life. She was used to something different in England. So her book talks about encounters with my people. And we are characterized in a very racist depiction because of her own Eurocentricity. And so because Susanna Moodie, I think, is so celebrated in my territory, there have been other forms of literature. Margaret Atwood has written a book of poetry that used this as a jumping off point. And it just figures so prominently. So I wanted to gesture towards it in the title, but then I don't mention it again in the book or in any of the works, because I think I wanted to focus on Anishinaabe present. I wanted to focus on Noopiming in the bush. I wanted to build Anishinaabe worlds. I wanted to build all the things that folks like Susanna Moodie, when they come into Indigenous territories, miss because of the blinders of white supremacy. So let's move on to the next slide, which is going back to the cover. So I, as a writer, this was my first attempt at a longer form. I had written 2 books of short stories and sort of several nonfiction and academic works. I didn't go to creative writing school. My background is in Anishinaabe storytelling as an oral practice. And so when I sat down to write a novel, I was sort of coming face to face with all of the structure of the Western novel and Western thought, the protagonist, the antagonist, the good versus evil, the plot, the resolution. None of that made sense to me, and none of that sort of worked within Anishinaabe storytelling practices, and it shut down my creativity. So I kind of gave myself permission to sort of write structurally whatever made sense to me, using Anishinaabe storytelling as a guide. And it ultimately leads to this book, which sort of blends poetry and song and video and performance and rehearsal into this sort of generative, I hope, generative site. I wanted to use a lot of Anishinaabe aesthetics in the book. So I wrote a lot of this book at dawn, in the morning. Our word for dawn is Betasamosake. It's composed of 3 smaller words. The Be means the future is coming at us. The Da means home or the present. And Ba is a suffix that you would add to someone's name when they've passed on. So it sort of means the past. So Betasamosake, or that first light, when the sun is rising up over the horizon, is the present, and the present is a collapsing of the future and the past in on itself. And so that became a really powerful sort of metaphor for presencing, for the Anishinaabe presence and Anishinaabe presence. My Anishinaabe life is very deeply relational. Everything that is alive has a spirit, and everything that has a spirit is interacting sort of all the time in this beautiful ecology of relationships that's complex. And so the characters in this book reflect that. There's humans, there's animals, there's trees, there's spirits, there's birds, and there's water. And I thought of bodies as sort of nodes in a network that are composed of all these different relationships. The characters in the book, that constellation, that ecology becomes place. So it sort of blurs the lines between land and bodies, which is also from Anishinaabe thinking. The main characters, the 7 main characters in the book, all use they, them pronouns. Because gender is constructed differently in Anishinaabe society. We have more than 2 genders. There's a fluidity around genders, and within the language, we don't have gendered pronouns. So I wanted to speak towards that in English. Like this cover image, I wanted to sort of push the trauma to the margins. So a lot of Indigenous literature in Canada right now is around processing trauma, around residential schools, around the violence, individual experiences of the violence of colonialism. And so I wanted to move away a little bit from that. And I wanted to create this world that was full of Anishinaabe joy and humor and love, where the trauma was there in the background, because that is our reality, but it wasn't driving the story. I wanted to recode a number of things. And if you think back to Rebecca Belmore's Tower and Tarpaulin, she's sort of recoding that shopping cart as a item that's connected to capitalism and consumerism, and remaking it the way that folks living on the street with precarious housing do, remaking it as a home and as an extension, as a belonging. So I asked myself a lot, like, did my ancestors have property? How did they relate to objects that were meaningful to them in their lives? And I came to the understanding that they did so because they were moving around the territory, because we have so many teaching against accumulation culturally, that they had special things, they had belongings. And so the Ninata character in the book, which is a maple tree, is pushing a shopping cart. And that's where they keep their special things. I talked about sort of expansive gender. There's a lot of space in the book. There's a lot of blank space in the pages. I wanted there to be quiet in the book. I wanted there to be space for the reader to engage in sort of a meaning-making process. The space slows the reading process down and allows for kind of a reflection and a conversation together. The book is circular in that you can sort of start anywhere and read the story and come back to that spot. I wrote it with an Anishinaabe audience in mind. So sort of I wrote for my people first, but not exclusively. And so I think people who have experiences with colonialism and the violence that comes with that, anti-colonial movements, anti-Blackness, heteropatriarchy, all of those things will also be able to find themselves inside the book. I wanted to have sort of a practice of hope in the book after Miriam Kawa's work, and space for joy and humor, and definitely a layering of meaning. If we can move to the next slide now. I also wanted the book to be this sort of site, a gathering site. And so one of the ways that I conceived of this was having different iterations of the project outside of just the book, because one of the things about a book is that you're not there when people are reading it. One of the things about being in a band and in performance is you're looking your audience right in the eye. So the first project is called the Noopiming Sessions, and I created this with my sister Ansley Simpson, who's a singer-songwriter and a composer in Toronto. And this is Ansley and I I think we're at the Book on the Rocks Folk Festival in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. And she runs a label called Gijiwe, which means she sings with a loud voice. And so we created a short album, which is available on Bandcamp, called the Noopiming Sessions. Let's move to the next slide. And this is just 4 readings from the book, actually, that are spoken over electronica. And we'll take a listen at one of those tracks in a second. The artwork in for this album was made by a Northern Shoshone artist named Leanne Marie Lita Charlie, who's based in Whitehorse. And the thing that I loved about this image is all of these lines, these layered lines that to me sort of represented ice and water, in kind of conversation with sky and mountains. And then the figure here is making their body into a home or into a tent frame house. So that seemed to fit in with a lot of the themes of the book. The first track on the Noopiming sessions is called Solidification. Let's move to the next slide. And Ansley and I decided to work with Sammy Chien. This is Sammy. He's a Taiwanese Canadian immigrant and queer artist of color who's an interdisciplinary artist, director, performer, researcher, and a mentor in film, sound art, and new media and performance. And Sammy was interested in making a video of Solidification, which is the very first part of the novel, the first pages of the novel. Can we move to the next slide? This is a still from the video, which we'll watch in a second. Sammy was interested in how the sound coded meaning and solidification and how this unlocked knowledge in the body. So Sammy used Isadora, which is a software program that enables artists to create performances and installations where video, sound, and light react interactively to sensory input. So we used the music to drive the visuals. I sent him the stem files. So when you're recording music, you record each voice or each instrument separately. So it's those files that I sent to him. And then he plugs them into Isadora. Each track plays and the software sends values to different channels. And then each channel is a video channel. This was made during the pandemic, and Sammy's father is a traditional Taiwanese woodblock does woodblock carvings. And so you can see in the video, you can see the woodblock carving that he did of the word solidification.
Once you move through cold, there is Pacific. Once you move through Pacific, there is Placid. Once you move through Placid, there is a condition of expanse. And it was in that condition of expanse that held me. I heard them singing above me. Mashkawaje fell through the ice to find quiet, to get out of the wind, to visit with Namegos. They all sang Mashkawaje stitches up the hole. They are so cold, they can't move. They are frozen stiff. The lake is their blanket. They all sang Mashkawaje is frozen stiff, still, calm. No one knows if they're coming back. They all sang Akawenze is fishing through the ice with a spear. They brought a line of beads. They will wait patiently. They will wait until Mashkawaje is done their visit. The singing and drumming came every night from a distance. Different choirs every evening at dusk, marking the passage of time, reminding me there is still love. You see, tragedy happened again. The details don't matter because the details are hopeless, overwhelmed, shut down. Know this, after 2 years, the best parts of me are still frozen in the lake. My limbic system, its best friend, the prefrontal cortex, and the hollow, pumping organ in which I keep benevolence. The only one that regularly comes to visit is Akawenze. In the winter, they park their truck on the ice, drill a hole with the auger and fish until the cold makes their bones crack. As soon as the ice is off the lake, Akawenze is back in their boat with a torch and a sort of pitchfork for spearing pickerel. In the dead of summer, Akawenze sneaks back before first light in their canoe, before their cottagers and their jet skis are out. In the fall, they sprinkle tobacco around me and sing. My world is muted. I look out. If something upsets me, I just wait, and the upset passes. I sit beside. Sometimes I remember the other me before I was frozen in the lake. I remember caring and engaging and the sharpness of unmuted feeling. I remember a hopeless connection. I don't feel stuck, in part because I don't feel anything. Their song isn't wrong. The ice is like a warm, weighted blanket. My form dissolved when tragedy came, and if I am fluid, the ice is container. There are ashes in my eyes. I am so far inside myself, like Miss Squatessi on a full fast, inside time, pulled inside their organs, inside their turtle shell, inside the sediments of the lake, while the ice world forms on top, oblivious to the outside with body as lake. And there is solace in being cut off, and there is freedom enmeshed within that state. Know this, being frozen in the lake is another kind of life. Know this, it is unclear how long before I will be done with my visit. It is unclear how long visiting takes. Know this, visiting is more of a dance than an event. Akawenze is my will, Nanatik is my lungs, Mindamoya is my conscience, Sabe is my marrow, Adik is my nervous system, Asin is my eyes and ears, Lucy is my brain. I believe everything these seven say because ice distorts perception and trust replaces critique, examination, interrogation. I believe everything these seven say, even though. I believe everything these seven say, even though their truths are their own, not mine. I believe in the absence of my own heart, I will accept the hearts of these seven. The geese fly overhead in the sheer grace of a carefully angled formation designed to take them elsewhere. There are still stars. There are still stars.
Awesome. So thank you. Thank you for your help there. Thank you for your patience, everybody. That's solidification. So that's the very beginning. The text that I was speaking is the very beginning of the book. Let's move on to the next slide. In the middle of the book, the main character, Mashkawaje means kishi, they are frozen in the lake, frozen stiff, writes a series of poems called The Theory of Ice. And so I took those poems and I worked with my band, and we converted those poems into lyrics and then into songs. And we released Theory of Ice last March on You've Changed Records. And it's in Canada and the US. So you can find it on all the streaming devices, platforms. It got an 8 out of 10 from Pitchfork. It was shortlisted for the Polaris Prize, which is in Canada is similar to the Mercury Prize in the UK. It's awarded annually for the best Canadian album based on artistic merit, not on album sales. The artwork for this album, well, actually, I think one of the things that's always that I can never predict, but the album traveled the farthest into the mainstream out of all of the work that came out of this project. Theory of Ice, the album art, you can see it on the slide, is by Nadia Meyer, who is an Anishinaabe artist, Algonquin artist based in Montreal. And in maybe 2008 or about 2005 to 2013, Nadia worked on a participatory project called the SCAR Project, where she invited people to sew with various fibers and materials onto canvas representations of their physical, emotional, psychological scars, metaphorical or literal scars that we carry, and then write an accompanying narrative. That ended up being a very, very heavy project for her. And so her next project, which was a response to the SCAR project, is where this image comes from. This image is called Orison 4, and it was part of a project where Nadia and her crew beaded the words of the Indian Act, which is the piece of legislation in Canada that till this day governs and kind of controls the lives of Indigenous or of Indian peoples or First Nations peoples from the cradle to the grave. So she beaded all of the words, and this then took photographs of the backs. So these are the threads and the stitches that are on the back of the beaded Indian Act. And I really thought that fit in well thematically and with the work that I was trying to bring together as a convergence in Noopiming, taking trauma and violence and hate and building something different and moving it into a different spot. And it also, the stitches sort of link up to Rebecca Balmore's work as well. And so that became the cover image for the vinyl and for the CD and for the digital versions of that book. And then I guess the next part of the project is working on videos or short films, actually, because I think that my music videos aren't really the standard Much music videos, but short films of some of the tracks on that. And so if we move to the next slide, this is Sandra Brewster, who's a fantastic Toronto-based artist who works with things like the materiality of storytelling and memory and experience and movement. And she puts those themes together often through photo-based gel transfers. And I asked her to make a video for one of the tracks on Theory of Ice called Viscosity. So if we just move to the still of that. And I was going to show the the video, but they're not streaming so well over Zoom. So I think that you can just look that up on YouTube on your own time if you're interested, and we can maybe get to having a discussion. So Viscosity, she filmed on her iPhone actually in a sort of like experimental video vibe from 70s or early 80s. And it explores, we were sort of exploring Indigenous and Black land-based politics in that film. So we were able to screen it at the Art Gallery of Ontario digitally, and we digitally screened it on a blog at the DIA in New York. The next film that you'll be able to find on YouTube, and we'll just move to the next slide, is by a Sinajak, who is an Inuk visual artist, writer, filmmaker, and curator from Inukjuak in Nunavik, which is in the northern part of Quebec. And a Sinajak took on the track Okay and Dykes, which is not in the book, but it's sort of a song that I wrote from the perspective of the Okay Glacier in Iceland, which was the glacier that died and doesn't exist anymore as a result of climate change. So it's related to the themes of the book. And then moving on to the next slide, Amanda Strong, who I've worked with a number of times now on a number of different projects, the short film Bedabin, the music video How to Steal a Canoe, is a Métis stop motion animation genius, I think. And her and her team are working on a short film, stop motion animation film called Breakup, and this is a still from that. It's I've just seen the rough cut, so it's not out yet, but it's coming. And then finally, the final slide is a series of like Indigenous women filmmaker rock stars. Carolyn Monet is in the top left-hand corner. She's working on Head of the Lake. Beside her is Amanda Strong, who we talked about with Breakup. And then below Amanda is Lisa Jackson. Lisa Jackson's working on I Pity the Country, which is a cover of a Willie Dunn song from the 1960s that is on the album Theory of Ice. And then beside Lisa is a Sinajak. So those videos will be coming out in the next 6 months, I think. So when I conceived of this project, it was before COVID. And so I thought that there would be like this amazing series of gatherings around book launches where the book would sort of travel and where different writers and different artists would sort of be involved in this co-meaning making. I thought that when I made the Noopiming sessions that we get to do at least one live show. I thought when I made Theory of Ice, I would get to have an album release party and show, and I would get to tour that. And touring is sort of important because I love that repetition. I love rehearsal. I love doing something over and over and over and over again as a practice, and then having different sort of knowledges spill out from that practice. And none of that has happened. I've met audiences in my bedroom on Zoom, which has been, I'm very, very grateful for as well. But I think that part of it in terms of moving on to my next projects, I think I'm almost having trouble. I don't even want to say that, but because I haven't had this traveling discussion, embodied experience of releasing something into the world and letting it go. So we'll see what happens. But that's the project Noopiming. I hope that you got a sense that it was sort of more than a book. And thank you very much for listening. And I think that we have some time for questions and discussion now.
So yes, thank you so much. It was amazing. For our attendees, if you could put questions in the chat, To start off, though, I do have a few questions. Just thinking about what you were saying about, I can't remember exactly what you said, but it made me think about borders, and how you have the Canadian border, the United States border, the Mexican border to the US, and then how that interplays with Indigenous identity, especially like contemporary Indigenous, like how does your community view borders? And if you want to talk a little bit about that, like government versus that way of life.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the state views borders as these guarded lines, where there things like sovereignty and self-determination ends, and where another state takes that up. And I think when I'm speaking about Anishinaabe formations or nationhood, I'm talking about something quite different, because we don't put sort of enclosures around our land and our bodies, and we don't think of that as property to be guarded, because we're coming from a really deeply relational culture where relationships are really, really important. So when you look at borders between Anishinaabe people and Haudenosaunee people, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is one of our neighbors. We share sort of Lake Ontario. I look at that as more of a zone of decreasing presence, where Anishinaabe presence is decreasing and Haudenosaunee presence is increasing. And those areas need a lot of attention. Those zones, they need a lot of ceremony, they need a lot of diplomacy, they need a lot of caring and maintenance of those relationships, because those are areas of overlap where there's intense sharing, and where there's potentially a lot of overlap and a lot of potential for conflict. So I think when you take borders out of that settler colonial context and out of the context of the state, and you think of them in terms of relationships, then and you put them sort of in a rubric of care, then I think you have a much different world. And I think that I want to try to, as an Anishinaabe person, I want to practice that. I want to practice that kind of diplomacy. I want to, when I think of Anishinaabe Nation, I don't think of this enclosure that's protected by an army and borders. I think of it as the time and the space that I'm sharing with birds and plants and animals and all different sorts of people.
How much of your, so you talked a little bit about how this project had gone more mainstream than other, how do you feel about, as an artist, mainstreaming your work, and where do you feel like it makes you vulnerable to appropriation in the culture, or would that be how much do you want people to adopt, in terms of if you mainstream it, then people start imitating a lot of times. So how do you feel, I guess what I'm getting to is, how do you feel about truly mainstreaming your work? What if you were as popular as Justin Bieber, for example, or
that would be horrifying. And I think it would mean that I feel like I would have done something wrong. So generally I don't have to worry about mainstreaming, and I don't have to worry about that with the kind of work that I do. I think the album was more popular than I thought it was going to be. And some of that is sort of just a function of the awards system in arts. Sometimes you're lucky and sometimes you're not. But one of the things that happened in releasing that work is that white people and the media respectfully, but decided that the album was very much about climate change. And it was a climate change album. And I think that wasn't my intent. I sort of had to kind of reconcile that with sort of, what your intent and what your execution is of your project. And then if you're open to having folks come in and make their own meaning, and then you've got white folks coming in and deciding it's about climate change, what does that say? I think that I became okay with that because I was like, it's kind of your problem and you guys really do need to fix it. Or we're all going to die. But I think what I've tried to do is alongside things like Theory of Ice, I've written books like As We Have Always Done, where I hope that people are having more complicated considerations around consent, around appropriation, around the consumption of Indigenous and Black art, literature, music, bodies, all of that sorts of things. So I hope that sometimes I hope it's gateway, that they sort of think that it's a cool album to listen to, and then they end up in sort of the midst of radical Indigenous politics and decolonial feminisms. Whoops.
That would be awesome. All right, so we have a question from Ann Laker. She says, the book features Indigenous beings as gleaners and recyclers. What does that mean in the modern context? And where does it figure into the Anishinaabe self-conception?
Yeah, I think like one of our sort of cornerstone teachings that you learn pretty early on is to share everything that you have, to use everything that you take, and to take only what you need. And so, yeah, I think that does speak to recycling and to gleaning and to being very careful about what you're taking from the environment, and to think about what you're also giving back, to have this sort of reciprocal relationship. And so it leads into a sort of thinking that's almost the opposite of something like sustainable development, where you're trying to figure out how you can have as much as possible while still keeping the earth intact. In our way of thinking, it's what can I give up to promote sustainability? What can I give up to promote the continuous rebirth of life, while also still taking care of myself and my family? And so I think that all of those, the characters in this book are very thrifty. They love a bargain. There's lots of recycling. There's lots of, there's a love of freebies and stuff like that in the book, which is a reflection of my community, and I think a deeper reflection of some of these ethics around consumerism and consumption.
So what do you like, and also thinking back to some of the things you were talking about in the original, kind of, it's not exactly, I know you didn't call it exactly, it was a response to Susan Moody's perception, correct?
Yeah.
But do you feel that, how much has that perception changed since 1852? Do you feel it has much, or is it just stagnant?
It's hard to say because I wasn't around in 1852,
Right.
And I think we like to think that things have changed and that things are much different now. But there's lots of evidence that colonialism is still in full swing. There's lots of examples of heteropatriarchy and transphobia and anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. And we don't have to look very far to find them. I think that it sort of cycles. We've had, last summer, a global uprising for Black life, and then you see sort of a backlash to that. So I think that in some ways, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was so much hope over like coming back and building better and building different. We're in the middle of COP26 right now, where like I'm just looking at the news and we're just gonna not meet the targets that we need to be meeting in order to make that real change. So I think it's something that requires constant vigilance and constant care of my Indigenous kin. And I think some things have changed for sure, and some things have become more entrenched.
And then, can you talk a little, did the theory of ice, was it happening at the same time, the creation of that, was that happening at the same time you were writing this book? Or, are those typically like, is that when you're writing, is there anything going on musically in your head or visually in your head? If you could talk a little bit about like your, process, or if those two things are connected, or is one building on the other, or?
They're very connected. They're so connected. I don't even know which came first. I would have been writing Noopiming and performing probably my previous album, which was called Flight. And so I would have been thinking about music. I think this poetry section in the book, often my lyrics start as poems, but when you bring lyrics in conversation with other artists and other instruments and other voices, there, particularly with music, there's an affect. So oftentimes I have to it needs to be less, there needs to be less words and less, the words have to do less work, I guess is what I'm trying to say, when you're bringing them in conversation with sound and interpreting them in sound. And so making an album is for me a really long process. It's a very collaborative process. So I would have been making this album probably after the first drafts of the book had been written, and it was sort of in an editing stage. And then I would have focused more on the writing, the demos, the going into the studio, workshopping the songs, recording, all of that process is sort of long. But the two things are very, very linked in my life and in my body.
All right. Here we have another question from Ann Laker. She's actually one of Big Heart's founders, and has been on the journey of reading the book with me, with your book with me. So Anne says, the book feels like an amalgamation of deep, powerful tradition and the flat irony of things like IKEA, Rogaine, and laws against elemental acts like making a fire. I found some humor in this juxtaposition. Was that purposeful on your part, or is it a byproduct?
It's very purposeful, because that's just what modern Indigenous life is like. Those are very, very real experiences. Having to negotiate with the university after an elder dies and you need to have a sacred fire as part of an Indigenous studies department, or in my territory, we are living in kind of cottage country for Toronto. Toronto is part of our territory. So we have huge urban metropolises on top of us, bringing us things like IKEA and Rogaine. And we're contemporary present people. So we're constantly interacting with those things. And humor as a practice is something that's really brings so much Anishinaabe joy. It's a coping mechanism, but it's more than a coping mechanism. It's something that's a community builder for us. So I think in some ways it was very, very deliberate. It was also just a reflection of my own family and my own community in the way that I think Anishinaabe people are interacting with those things, and the absurdity of it, because it is a juxtaposition, but it's a real juxtaposition that we are constantly negotiating.
All right. Is there anything, like, does anyone have any other questions, or is there anything you would like to add, Leanne?
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for reading. This has been a really lovely way to spend some time on a Friday afternoon.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. And also, I want to thank the program that made this talk possible. I'd like to thank Arts Midwest Gig Fund, a program of Arts Midwest that is funded by the National Endowment of the Arts, with additional contributions from the Indiana Arts Commission. So again, very grateful to those sources that make make these programs possible, and getting us almost as face to face as we can with you. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much. Bye now.
Bye.